the host to enable screen sharing for, and then we'll be ready to go.
It wouldn't be a Zoom call without it.
Exactly. Okay.
See if it can go now, Julie.
Absolutely. Here we go. Okay, and the idea here of having this short meeting tonight and letting people have a chance to experience a circle is the training in February it's a commitment. It's several days, and it's not a well understood type of restorative justice is not well understood. So you may be looking at, you may be with us tonight because you're interested in getting the training. You may be sort of the point person for your group or organization to check it out and see if it's something that makes sense for your group. But we thought something brief would be helpful to answer some questions. Now, part of the issue with what restorative justice is there are a lot of similar terms, and they're in some cases connected. But what happens is they get kind of, they get mixed up. Restorative justice hopefully leads to transformative justice. There is a focus and a priority on the victim. The goal is healing. It is sometimes considered the same thing as reparations, which it is not, nor is it retributive. So kind of a little bit of an introduction of what it is and what it's not might be helpful. It's a system. It's intended to put the wrongs right. It's about healing, and it's about community. If you consider retributive justice, which is what here in the United States we use so extensively, that you commit a crime and you are charged in a court of law and you go to jail or you are somehow punished, that doesn't always meet the needs of whoever was harmed. It doesn't meet the needs of the community. And oftentimes it puts the person, the offender, in a worse place than they were before. So the community doesn't get any better. The individual doesn't get any better. Restorative justice looks at a lot broader list of needs. Now, when you look at restorative justice, sometimes you almost have to separate this process and the harm, because you're doing this because there was trauma, that there was harm. And in our local area, the harm was first identified very publicly in 2013 when the Ramsey County brought charges of failure to protect children against the Archdiocese of St. Paul and Minneapolis. The picture on the right has our new Archbishop, Archbishop Bernard Hebda, along with, on the far left, the Ramsey County attorney, a gentleman by the name of John Choi. When the settlement was reached, which included civil charges, criminal charges, a bankruptcy, and the previous Archbishop resigned, restorative justice was actually part of the settlement agreement. John Choi is known for being a very big picture lawyer. He knew that certainly the people who had been harmed those victims were paramount, but there are almost 3.5 million Catholics in the Twin Cities. And the harm that had a ripple effect, that peripheral harm, the secondary harm, was also significant. People were angry. People were being asked to take second collections to pay for some of the bankruptcy issues. So what we did at that point was Archbishop had to identify 3 parishes, and Our Lady of Lourdes was one of them. And because Father Griffith had some understanding of restorative justice, and he is also a lawyer, we were sort of pulled into that world. Now, how did we do that? You know, it was a combination of things. We went to parish outreach. We were at a different parish in the Archdiocese every week, every month. And Father would celebrate Mass. He had what some parishes thought was a long homily. He went a little long sometimes, 10, 15 minutes, and talked about justice in Scripture, and why this really does have roots in our faith. And then there were gatherings afterward, and there were tough questions. People wanted to know, which priests were in which nursing homes, and were they getting retirement packages, and what was being done for victim survivors, and the important part of all of this, because it often included circles, healing circles, is we talked about it. And I don't know if you caught much of the inauguration yesterday or the day before, when President Biden commented, you have to look at the things that hurt, and it hurts to look at those things, but that's how we heal. And in the bottom right-hand corner is, if you haven't met Janine Geske, Father Dan and Janine are sharing a chuckle about something that was at Lumen Christi over in St. Paul. Another example of how restorative justice is used, healing circles is used, is at the Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation. These folks are in Chicago, in South Chicago, where there's lots of issues with drugs, with gangs, with juvenile criminal issues. The harm there is a situation where these primarily young men just are not getting out of a cycle of poverty, addiction, and education issues. It's a very similar situation. That's the harm. They use restorative justice as a tool. This is Father Dave Kelly, who is standing up along the wall there, and some training that I attended a couple of years ago. And this was a more extensive 4 days, all of the steps in the process. And I remember thinking at first, it's going to take 4 days to learn how to actively listen. But when you spend the time with it, because it is something that requires that you go deeper, particularly if you plan to be a trainer and share this process with other people. They're amazing what they're doing in the Chicago area, and we learned so much. The Minnesota Peace Building Leadership Institute was doing this work before it was real well known. Again, a lot of it was in juvenile situations, and a lot of it was around race, systemic racism. Well, if any of you are familiar with what the Twin Cities experienced in May, this is the area around 38th Street in Chicago, not far off of Lake Street, where the 3rd Precinct is located. We drive by there every other day, going to St. Paul to see one of our kids. So the protests, the riots, and the lootings that followed George Floyd's murder went on for weeks. We lived downtown in a condo, which we liked because we were right on the Mississippi River. We're across the street from where the Vikings play football at US Bank. It was weeks of Black Hawk helicopters around around our building and throughout downtown. What we're finding now is, as much as our Catholic community is focused on restorative justice for the harms resulting from clerical abuse, now when we've gone to parishes, they're starting to say, and we need to talk about race too. So it's really caused us to take a hard look at, how do we take this conversation now and expand it to another kind of trauma that folks in this community experienced last May, well, and still. If you're familiar with Catholic Mobilizing Network, they do work very focused on ending the death penalty. They have stepped up as far as being leaders and advocates for restorative justice as well. It really dovetails beautifully when you think about it with what the work they're doing. Something that stops that chain of someone that has a relatively minor offense as a teenager, ends up having successive charges that have them incarcerated for life. That kind of a chance to find ways, find a different way that's tied in closer to, frankly, our faith. And Father Dan and Janine and I were so appreciative of the hospitality when we came to Wheeling last year. Oh my gosh. Well, and we look back on that and talk about it often because your folks were so kind and so welcoming. And also for all of us, when we got home, that was when, that's the last time I was on a plane. It's the last time I've left Minneapolis. So it feels like that was the before of the world. And this has very much been kind of the after of the world. I'll talk real briefly about how you can look at restorative justice. This is all from Howard Zer's books. And as I mentioned, he's the guy. All roads lead to Harrisonburg, Virginia, when you're talking about restorative justice. But if you're thinking in threes, I'm going to turn it off here so I can look at I don't want to see my face. I want to see the whole screen. Perfect. 3 assumptions. When people are harmed, needs are created. The needs that are created lead to obligations. And the obligation is to put right the harms. I didn't skip one, did I? 3 principles. One of the principles of restorative justice is you repair the harm and you reveal what that wrongdoing, what happened. I mean, it comes back to that earlier point about we talk about it. It encourages responsibility for addressing needs and repairing harm. We saw this demonstrated beautifully with Archbishop Hebda here locally. We had one circle at Knights of Columbus Hall for the parish of St. Wenceslas, a little bit south, a rural community in the Twin Cities. And these German farmers, they weren't having any of the conversation. It meant so much that he came. When it came to the part about breaking into circles, I'd been in dozens and dozens of circles by that time. And it was one of the first beautiful days in May that we had. And I thought, oh, I'm going to go outside when they do circles. I would really love a break and some sunshine. And darn if, when it was circle time, Archbishop Hebda joined a circle. He walked over and he looked at everybody there and said, mind if I join you guys? Well, imagine the impact that had. But, hearing from him that, and that active listening that those people in the circle participated in was very meaningful. We talk about the people with the direct harm, and our archdiocese has an outreach coordinator who has Zoom calls for victim survivors, very specific. It's very focused on their needs, those small groups of people that have chosen to be involved in that. The peripheral harm, the people that feel like their kids don't come to Mass anymore. Their coworkers want to know, why are you still Catholic? The loss of faith, how trust was impacted, that peripheral harm is the majority of the people that we see in the circles when we visit the parishes. 3 important values. Everyone is treated with respect in the circles. Everyone is responsible for participating in the circles according to the guidelines that the circle keeper shares at the beginning. And also very importantly, we're in relationship. It's so critically important, particularly today in our country, to remember that none of us are here without that relationship with one another. And the circles, are very basic. Who has been hurt? What are their needs? Who has the obligation to address the needs, to put right the harms, to restore the relationships? And it's always interesting to see what a variety of people's needs are. In some cases, they're like, I want to hear an apology from this person. Other people are like, I want more information about what they're doing in the seminary these days. It varies. But I can't emphasize enough, the important thing is we're talking about it. And the incredible power of a circle and getting that stuff out there is a first step towards healing. And I often say that the circle itself it's a sacred space. People that you would never expect would open up in any kind of significant way. They share what's on their heart, and it becomes a very special place. So what do we want to accomplish with all of this? The desire to live in right relationship with one another, with creation, with our community, and with the Creator. So I like this quote because as much as time as I've spent on restorative justice in the last few years, I sometimes stumble when people ask me for a definition. It's a process, but it's not a map. The principles can be a compass. It gives you direction about living restoratively. And at its basic line, it's an invitation for dialogue and exploration. Now let's talk about, I've got 2 slides on circles, and then I'll throw it back to Sister Rosie. The purpose is to open up conversation. It's about listening. It's about personal sharing. The conversation happens in rounds with the ability to pass. The circle keeper facilitates the rounds. It's amazing how powerful it is just to have somebody listen to you, not waiting till it's their turn to respond, just listening to you. And there are times when it's the circle keeper has to be direct about the no interruptions and no crosstalk, because this is about listening and being listened to. A few more points about the power of the circle. You're asked to speak your truth. We presume everyone in the circle will demonstrate candor, honor, assume the impact of what they're saying. We know that sometimes circles can bring up tough subjects. The folks at Wheeling did a terrific job of identifying at the onset of the time that we spent with you, who some counselors were in the back of the room. Of all the ones that I have done, there was one time when a man stood up abruptly and left, and someone left to ask him, to accompany him and just say, "Are you okay? Would you like to talk either now or down the road with someone?" But making sure that anything that it did bubble up, if they're in pain, that someone is there to accompany them. Understanding that there's multiple truths. The way I might look at the events that happened in St. Paul and Minneapolis might be different than, it likely is different than the way somebody else is going to look at them. And then highly confidential. We'll say oftentimes the stories stay, the lessons leave. All the information that is shared in the circle is handled confidentially. I'm almost done with Fratelli Tutti, and I actually started reading it January 6th. But there are just several great lines in Francis' encyclical that basically speak to and support restorative justice. Knowing how to dialogue is the way to open up the world and build social friendship. That dialogue seeks and respects the truth. And that dialogue gives rise to a culture of encounter, becomes a way of life. Whoever dialogues is generous, recognizing and respects the other. It's not enough to just engage in encounter. We have to face the reality of the injuries of the past, of misencounters. And we have to establish and walk the paths as we re-encounter. We need to heal the wounds, which requires seeking and forgiveness. To forgive is not to forget. And his last point that I think ties closely with restorative justice, we need to be daring and start from the truth. The recognition of the historical truth, which is inseparable companion of justice and mercy, which advances us towards peace. So those are, it's a huge topic area. This is just a slice of some applications that we've used locally. We have found the restorative justice work that was done in this archdiocese to be just life-changing. It's changed hearts. And the support we've had from Archbishop Hebda has just been terrific. It's not always stories that you want to hear. You get and you go into it knowing people are going to be angry in those circles. But man, talk about a way to find that path forward to healing.
Okay, thank you, Julie.
And I will stop the share and turn it back to you, Rosie.
Okay, thank you. So we wanted to get as much information as we could in for an hour and hold ourselves to that hour if we could. So if you have questions, we'd be glad for you to put those in the chat bar. If there's time at the end, we'll start answering them. And then if people want to stay longer and ask questions or have discussion, the panel is willing to stay after 7. If people have questions or something they want to talk about. So, but if you have questions for now, you might just put those in the chat bar and Mark will collect those. So I think Father Hadi and Deborah, please.
I think I'm going to go first, right? Father Hadi. Yeah. Well, good evening, everyone. So my task is to say a little bit about the connections between restorative justice and Catholic social teaching, and then to say something even briefer about restorative justice and race and racism. So I want to be expeditious here. I want to first just echo what Julie said in recalling Fratelli Tutti, the latest encyclical of Francis's, and I think the point she highlighted really do speak to how this Pope is sort of embodying restorative justice in his work and in his writings. And even if that term is not directly invoked, it's assumed, I think. And there's, as I'll say in a minute, a bit of a restorative justice orientation to how he thinks and lives and writes and teaches and embodies the gospel. And I love in Julie's slide the quote about counter, which is so counterintuitive to how we engage in our culture, right? And so I think that's a point worth noting in restorative justice broadly. It's so counterintuitive to how we engage with each other, even if we're not talking about serious harm or crime, just this practice of engaging in circles, this practice of deep listening, this practice of wanting real encounter more than just superficial engagement. And Francis is in many ways embodying that for us. But again, just briefly here to do a quick tour through the tradition. I mean, if you think about the very first papal encyclical, Rerum Novarum, which was about, the dignity of workers and what we might today call predatory capitalism, being that force and phenomenon that really stripped people of dignity, and how that encyclical sort of began this whole movement in Catholic social teaching that at the heart of how we think about our life together based on the gospel is that the defense of human life and dignity is that starting point, that every person is created in the image of God, that bears the likeness of God, has an inviolable dignity, regardless of race, gender, class, all other identity markers we might use to identify ourselves and others. And restorative justice is at heart about upholding, helping people reclaim dignity when that dignity has been violated or stripped in whatever the situations of harm might have been. There are some documents in Catholic social teaching, and I want to be clear that I'm not an expert in this or on this, but what I know is that there are some documents that make some direct reference to restoration and to restorative justice in a, if not direct way, a pretty open way. The Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church, which was produced in 2004, I think, mentions the need to foster a justice that reconciles. It noted that the church needs to reject the idea that justice can be sought through recourse to war. So again, there's the underpinnings of a rejection of retribution and an embrace of restoration. In 2000, the US Conference of Catholic Bishops issued a statement, Responsibility, Rehabilitation, and Restoration, Catholic Perspective on Crime and Criminal Justice. And I was just skimming that again the other day in prep for this, and I was kind of reminded how it ought to be sort of brought to the fore again. And a lot has changed socially, culturally, ecclesially in that time. But that document is again pretty overt about the what needs to be corrected in a retributive model. And so there's again that kind of undergirding of a restorative justice ethos there. But I think we come full circle back to Pope Francis, and Laudato Si, I think, is maybe the encyclical that, while again not naming restorative justice overtly or directly, presents an unmistakable orientation of and toward restorative justice. If you've read that encyclical, you know he kind of coined a term that was sort of seen as at the heart of that document, which is integral theology. This idea that everything is connected, that we can't think about our life of faith, we can't think about our life as a person in community, a citizen of the world, a fellow creature, without recognizing that everything is connected, interconnected, that the nature of being human is one of deep connection. We are made for connection. We don't thrive apart from connection. And this has all sorts of implications for our relationship to the created order, right? Which was what Laudato Si is fundamentally about. And so if everything is connected, if I don't thrive without my neighbors thriving, and if my neighbor is not just a person, but an ecosystem or another part of the natural world, that when something is not thriving, when something has been harmed, attention has to be given to that. And I think he sort of does restorative justice theology in that document, again, without naming it. So what are the harms that need to be addressed in ways that we have sort of damaged the natural order? What are the obligations that arise from that? And our common home, he says in that document, is our sister who cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted. And so I think while Catholic social teaching is at its heart about upholding the dignity of the human person, it's also, and I think Francis has reminded us of this in the last decade or so, the dignity of every created thing, right? And so the poor and vulnerable suffer more from the violence that we do to the earth. That brings us back to the human realm, that if restoration has to happen for creation, we also have to acknowledge that the harm that we're doing to the world is disproportionately affecting the poor and the vulnerable. And that requires, as he says, a kind of ecological conversion. And so my hope is that Catholic social teaching will continue to evolve toward this more robust and more direct and more explicit account of restorative justice that can really be a resource for addressing harm honestly, both in the human realm and in the realm of all of creation. And then just briefly on restorative justice and race, I'm going to share the screen to put up one slide of a relatively new book that I think it needs to be sort of known about. And the book is called Colorizing Restorative Justice. It's edited by, and all the essays in it are written by persons of color, both African Americans and persons from indigenous communities. I'm not going to read that blurb there, but if you want to take it in there, and maybe this is something else we could share with folks later. What's important about this book, I think there are a couple things that are important about it. It's also, as Julie mentioned earlier, it helps to reclaim the indigenous roots of restorative justice. It is true that restorative justice as a kind of movement, a kind of social movement, is fairly recent, especially with the work of Howard Zehr in the last 40 years or so. But the traditions, the practices, the ethos, the resources are ancient across a lot of world traditions. And so this book reminds us of that. But it's a book that white folks need to read for a couple of reasons. One, again, to just be reminded of the indigenous roots of restorative justice, that communities of color across time and space have been practicing this way of restoring people to community long before many of us got interested. But it's also because sometimes, especially in predominantly white communities, when we care so much about addressing harm, figuring out what the obligations are, figuring out how we try to restore people back to community, there can be sometimes, and this is part of the critique that these authors raise, a kind of fix it now culture I think that's sort of embedded a little bit in whiteness, that there's a problem, we need to fix it, we need that solution. And there's a reminder here that it doesn't quite work that way, and sometimes whiteness, and I don't just mean that as skin color, right, but as a kind of social and political reality, can miss what's important about how indigenous communities and other communities of color can teach us how to do this work without that impulse that sometimes predominantly white communities can have, with the best of intentions. And also, I think lastly, that book and what it talks about really does get at the power differentials that are often at play in restorative justice work that sometimes white practitioners can be a little bit blind to. And so the need to pay a little more attention to how power is operative, who is wielding it and who is being denied it. So it's a good book for that. And so I offer that as something I think to be aware of, whether you're brand new to restorative justice work or have been at it for a while. So I am done, and I will turn it over to Father Hadi.
Hi, I'm Father Hadi. I'm a Jesuit priest here in Wheeling University, working in campus ministry. I will continue the part about biblical and theological foundations. One of the things in one of the presentation I listened to Father Dan Griffith, he reminded us about different types of biblical justices. Retributive justice, which has to do with punishment proportional to the offense committed. Distributive justice, it has to do a lot about socially just allocation of resources, and also fairness associated with decision outcomes and distribution of resources. And of course, restorative justice, which has to do with upholding dignity, seeing to the well-being of all, including all of creations, and also seeks to heal and put rights to wrongs. When I presented any of this introduction to restorative justice, I usually rely on stories. Part of it is because when you do actually practice the restorative circles, it is stories of people sharing with one another. So usually I ask students about what are some of the biblical stories that illustrate restorative justice. And a lot of people can recognize stories of retributive justice in the Bible. So In terms of restorative justice, one of the famous toward the end of Genesis has to do with Joseph, his reconciliation with his brothers, and then being reunited with Jacob, his father. So that was actually a lot of dialogues, a lot of encounters, and it's not always easy. There is a long journey in terms of the process of reconciliations in restoring their family there. The other one that a lot of students right away recognize is the parable of the prodigal sons. And we have seen many paintings about it, and we recognize in terms of like how there is harm, and yet at the same time there is healing. And it's not just the healing for those who are harmed, but then also those who offended others. And last fall, when I was presenting this to the first year seminar, one of the freshman students raised his hand and then said he had an example. And then when I asked, he pointed out about Peter after Jesus' resurrections, when Jesus asked him, "Do you love me?" And one of the things that he pointed out is instead of punishing Peter for denying him 3 times, he actually restored him, restored to a loving relationship with Jesus. And with all that, also restoring the relationship with the apostles. Because if you remember, the apostles, many of them abandoned Jesus during the crucifixions. So those are some of the stories that we recognize, we pull out of the Bibles. And I'm sure in our lives, as we continue our journey, you will discover more and more stories of restorative justice. In terms of sacramental practice, the other part of restorative justice that I recognize is in the sacrament of reconciliation. Now, during my theological study, one of the things I realized that I'm glad that I did not learn what type of punishment is appropriate for which sin in the sacrament of reconciliations. It's not like a manual, okay, if there's penitence in this way, this is the prescribed punishment. So I'm glad that I never learned that in theology. On the other hand, we were asked to focus on relation. So any sinful act is an act that breaks relationship, either with oneself, with others, with God, and also with creations. And the whole idea of a sacrament is the grace of pardon from God, and also reconciling not just with God, but with the church, with the whole community. And so one of the things in my pastoral experience is before I formally learned restorative justice, I began practicing that restorative principles in the sacrament of reconciliation. In the confessions, I began praying for an appropriate penance for a penitent, when I'm asking God for a penance that can help restore the penitent's relation with God, with others, and with himself or herself. So one of the things I recognize in my own sacramental practice is that I do not seek a penance as punitive consequence of the penitent's sins. So one of the things that I recognize also in the practice of restorative circles, I've witnessed quite a number of people, the experience of being heard, being listened, and being loved can also lead to perfect contrition because of God's love experienced through the circle, rather than out of fear for punishments, which is in the Catechism is considered imperfect contritions. So this is in terms of the restorative justice from the sacramental perspective in my own pastoral experience. And so I will turn it over, continue with Julie and Rosie for the next part.
Okay, thank you, Father Hadi and Deborah Murphy. That was very helpful. Deborah is a professor at West Virginia Wesleyan, and I think you're starting a restorative justice center there, Deborah. Am I right in thinking that?
Yes.
So we're delighted that she was able to join us also here this evening. One of the points we wanted to be clear about is when Howard Zehr first brought the awareness of restorative justice to a lot of us, it was involved in the criminal justice system. And I first heard about it when I worked at a prison for women in Alderson. And then, as Julie mentioned, you know, her experience was seeing it in the church. But one of the things we're discovering is that there are a lot of ways to use this whole circle process that helps to build community, because it is so focused on people having the opportunity to speak their truth from their hearts, and also to listen and to hear each other. So one of the ways we thought it could be used in parishes and in organizations is using the circle process in a lot of our everyday almost kind of ways. And so I just wanted to share a few of those that have been part of my experience. I know there are some schools that are beginning to use restorative justice as part of their process. And so instead of suspending schools, they might be more likely, suspending the student, they might be more likely to hold a circle to kind of hear what was going on with them, or in a bullying situation, you know, to set it up in a way that the students can kind of hear where each other was coming from. And so you don't always just begin by using the circles where there's a tragedy or a trauma or harm. You can also, like some schools will just begin their days with the classrooms using the circle as part of, like, you know, how you come this morning to school. So I have used them with middle school kids, and in one of them, the teacher picked it up and started using it with their students. I've also used it with a summer camp, and the kids, the circle uses a talking piece. And so one day we decorated rocks as they would use as a talking piece. And the next day they, in the circle process, they explained their rock and what they had meaningful on it. Another situation was when someone made a racist remark in a work situation. It was a nonprofit, and the board was thinking of firing the person. And someone said, well, Rosie knows about restorative justice. What if we tried that? So we met with the person who had been offended, and she was willing to proceed in the process. And so we met in a circle with the woman who had made the remark, and she was willing to apologize. So we met with the two of them and the whole staff. And in that process, the staff were saying, well, you know, we all make remarks, you know, like we called people retard, or, you know, may use other words that aren't helpful. So it became a learning for the whole staff. But in parishes especially, I've used it in terms of Lenten programs. Julie mentioned Catholic Mobilizing Network. They have a Lenten process that you know, kind of gives you the videos, gives you the info, gives you the questions that you can take and use either for a retreat setting or for a Lenten program. We've used it in a parish with a book study, looking at the book White Fragility. I've used it in family conferencing. If there's a family stress situation, to invite the members of that family into a circle and to have a discussion about that, or just, you know, a discussion that enables them to kind of hear each other, and sometimes hear each other on a different level for the first time. And it can also be used for fun things, like one friend used it for the 50th anniversary of her husband, and people, you know, joined in the circle to say how he had touched their lives. So because these circles can be community building and used in so many different ways, that was one of the reasons we wanted to offer the idea, especially to churches and some other groups. So we're going to have a circle experience on February 6th, and Mark may tell you a little bit more about that. And some of this is in preparation for the training that we're planning the end of February. But we thought people might want to know more about ways they might want to use that training before we move to there. So Mark, I'll pass this on to you.
Sure. Many of you saw when you registered for this event that there's an additional 3-hour circle experience coming up in a couple of weeks. February 6th, I believe the date is, Saturday, 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. You'll note that while many of us are coming to this conversation, from an experience using restorative justice within a Catholic church setting. That's not what the 3-hour circle experience will be focused on, nor is that what the training later in February will be focused on. And we've been kind of talking about this training in February, but many of you do not know all of the details. We've been working with a couple of folks to provide a virtual training that will happen at the end of February over 4 days, 4 mornings, so that anyone who's interested in utilizing restorative justice in a parish or organization or family can do that work at the end of that. The circle experience between now and then is to give all of you an opportunity to do it yourselves if you're interested. If you've found that this conversation has been helpful and you want to know more, or have colleagues that might want to know more, there's still plenty of time to register for that at rjwv.org. I'll send a follow-up here, and we'll send more information on the late February training as it gets a little bit closer. We have some details to work out still, but we'll have that going soon. Is that all I needed to say, Rosie?
I think so. I think
Okay,
we're
great.
good. So if we have a few minutes, we could take maybe a question or two. Did any come in through the chat?
I didn't have any come in through the chat. I had one from Glynis at Grove who was asking about whether this was a specifically Catholic practice, and I simply typed back to her and indicated that it was not. And in fact, the Catholic Church is pretty late to restorative justice, but hopefully that'll change.
Yeah, I also work with a group in Charleston where we use the circle model as part of our regular meetings. And I start to feel like I'm missing it sometimes when I'm in a meeting, because at least in a circle, I know I'm going to get a chance to talk and add my 2 cents worth. And I don't have to wait till the other person gets quiet to jump in. So I really like having the circles. We also have used it in the community around some issues like racism and things that are ecology and race and restorative justice, some topics that people might have different perspectives on. And as someone mentioned, I think Father Hadi, it's about telling the stories and coming to a deeper understanding of where the people are coming from. You know, kind of, it's like when you hear someone's story, it makes such a difference. Yes, Benson.
I couldn't find a way to raise my hand in the chat, so I literally raised my hand.
Vincent, can I pop on for just a second?
Go ahead.
I just made Julie the host because I've got another Zoom. So you'll see my picture, but I won't be here. Or you'll see my logo, but I won't be here. I'll be on the adjacent computer, starting another one. But you guys can feel free to go on. Julie, can you see the questions in the chat?
Somebody send a new one. I can see chat. Yeah. Yeah, I should be able to field any questions. Sure.
Great. I'm going to send one to you that was sent to me, and then you should be able to get the rest of them. And thank you all. And I apologize for having to hop off here.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Mark. My question to, I guess, the group until another one comes in. When or is restorative justice finished? When's it done? You know, with the retributive justice that we're most used to, there's like a trial and a judge, and then, you know, you do something and you're done. When or, is restorative justice finished?
So I would say, others may have an idea about this too, but I would say it's finished when the group says it's finished. Like if you're just using it